Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to warmly welcome you to this webinar on understanding child labor risks in companies' value chains. Thank you so much for being with us today. I am Alice Harbach-Forel. I head the programs at the UN Global Compact Network Switzerland and Liechtenstein. This is the local chapter of the UN Global Compact initiative that counts more than 18,000 business participants worldwide. The objective of our network, The objective of our network is to draw the attention of companies to the relevance of social and environmental issues for their activities and to support them in the implementation of responsible business practices through trainings and other learning formats. We encourage dialogue and knowledge exchange between experts and the private sectors. And we support our member companies to act responsibly along the 10 principles that you see on the screen and to develop innovative solutions to achieve the SDGs that you also see on the screen. I am your host today because we have been mandated by the SECO to organize and conduct a webinar series on child labor due diligence with the aim to support and guide companies in the implementation of their child labor due diligence process and promote the exchange of experience and good practices. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Valerie and Miriam from the SECO for their trust and for the pleasant collaboration. So today's webinar is the first webinar of this series that will run until the end of June. So as you see on the screen, the webinar series will be composed of 4 webinars, over the course of which the concept of child labor will be introduced and all the necessary steps to establish a solid child labor due diligence process will be explained. The webinars will cover the topics of the ILO/IOE child labor guidance tools for business and present many practical examples, as well as case studies by companies and child labor experts. At the end of each session, we will have enough time for question and discussion. You have the possibility to register for the webinars on our website, and we will share the link again in the chat. Today, we will focus on understanding what is child labor and what are the risks and impacts in companies' value chains. The agenda for today looks as follows. We will first hear the voice of the Swiss Confederation through Valérie Berset-Bircher. She's ambassador and head of international labor affairs at the State Secretariat for Economic Affairs. She will explain the Swiss context with regards to child labor issues. We will go on with a presentation by Sophie de Konink. She is Chief of Operations, Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work branch at the International Labour Organization. Sophie will explain the current definition, trends, and root causes of child labor. This will be followed by a presentation by Rita Yip. She's a Senior Advisor, International Organization of Employers. Rita Yip will provide us insight into the ILO/IOE Child Labor Guidance Tool and why the tool was developed. So we will then go on. We have a lot of speakers today. We will go on to Sandra Groth. She is Sustainable Supply Chain Manager at Save the Children Switzerland, and she will explain us which role and responsibility companies may have in preventing or worsening child labor risks. This will be followed by Ines Kempfer. She is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Child Rights and Business, and she will provide case studies and examples from the ground. I would like to thank all the speakers for their time, preparation, dedication today. And before I hand over to Valérie Berset, I will just show you a few housekeeping rules. So just that you know, the session is recorded. The slides as well as the recording will be sent to you after the webinar or in the upcoming days, I would say. Please write your questions in the chat. We will have time to answer them at the end of the webinar. With this, I would like to hand over to Valérie Berset-Bircher for her presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alice, and thank you to your team for giving me the floor. I would also like to warmly welcome all of you today to this webinar. And of course, also, I would like to thank the next speaker that will intervene after me. I have seen that we have a majority of female speakers, so it's nice sometimes to to have this change. The Swiss State Secretary for Economic Affairs is collaborating with the Global Compact Network, Switzerland and Liechtenstein on this 4-part webinar as it was presented on child labor due diligence. And I would like very shortly to introduce the context of this collaboration. Next slide, please. Thank you. Swiss companies can also be affected by child labor. And I would like to remind and recall the basic definition of child labor. It is defined as work that deprives children of their childhood, their potential, and their dignity, and that is harmful to physical and mental development. In 2020, the International Labour Organization estimated that 160 million children are engaged in child labor in the whole world. And of course, you will get more information from the ILO side later on. It can be found, child labor, not only in global supply chain, but also in domestic supply chain. A significant share of child labor in global supply chain occurs in upstream industries, or as we could also say, in lower tier supply chain of the supply chain. Here we talk, for example, about not automatically about the final stage of production, but we find mainly child labor in, for example, raw material extraction and agriculture sector. This makes due diligence, visibility, traceability quite a challenge. Next slide, please. Let me come very shortly come back to the Swiss legislative developments, even though this webinar will be broader than just explaining and implementing the Swiss Swiss obligation. First of all, I'd like to recall and remind to everyone that Switzerland has ratified the 2 fundamental conventions on child labor, 2 fundamental and core labor conventions from the ILO, and this is very important. Of course, this is also an obligation as a country and for enterprises to implement no child labor in their workplace. The legislative development in Switzerland are now being implemented. You know, the entry into force started beginning of this year, and the Swiss enterprises will need to report as of next year about 3 different topics or obligations. The first one is a reporting obligation on non-financial issues, very similar to the European Non-Financial Reporting Directive. It covers environmental, social, staff issues, as well as human rights and anti-corruption. Secondly, in Switzerland, there is now a due diligence obligation on conflict minerals, similar also to the European Conflict Mineral Regulation. It applies to firms that release for free circulation in Switzerland or process in Switzerland certain minerals or metals from conflict zones or high-risk areas. And thirdly, there is a due diligence obligation for enterprises that offer goods or services for which there is a well-founded suspicion of child labor. Enterprises whose headquarters, head office, or main office is in Switzerland will have to comply with the due diligence requirements in the supply chain and report on them if there is a reasonable suspicion that a product or a service was produced using child labor. The enterprises subject to this law will have to put in place a management system, and define their supply chain policy for products and services if there is a reasonable suspicion of child labor. They will have to identify and evaluate the risk of adverse effects in their supply chain, draw up a risk management plan, and take steps to minimize identified risk. There is an ordinance that details the obligation and set out also the exception. But as I said at the beginning, today the webinar is not to focus on the compliance discussion with the Swiss law, but it's a bit broader because, as you know, there are due diligence obligation broadly coming up in Europe, but also we are already, not concerned, but we are already interested by the new obligation from the Lieferkettengesetz in Germany, because we see that there is already an impact on Swiss enterprises, and we get also quite a lot of questions from Swiss Enterprise Association about this new law in Germany. We would like this webinar to show how to apply international frameworks on child labor due diligence. It should support companies to have already identified that they are subject to the law, or companies which simply do the due diligence on a voluntary basis. It should help and accompany all of you. This webinar series takes place in a clear framework. It is the Swiss National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, which is under the leadership of the Department of Economic Affairs as well as the Department of Foreign Affairs in Switzerland. And it is the duty of the Swiss government to support companies as well as to accompany companies in the implementation of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And later on, at the end of this webinar, we would be very interested to know what kind of support or advice or network Swiss companies still need in the framework of our National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, because we intend to revise it in the next year. And of course, the governments need to know what kind of support is needed. The first National Action Plan was adopted in 2016. It was a parliamentary request, and it was revised for a period of 2020 to 2023. And now we are already discussing and working on the next National Action Plan starting in 2024. We have developed different tools, guidelines, awareness raising activities, and on the next slide you have some example. We have, for example, developed or translated useful tools that you can find on our website. The first one, and it will be also at the heart of your discussion today, the ILO IOE Child Labor Guidance Tool for Business, because this is an international framework which has been agreed on. And of course, Rita Yip from the International Organization of Employers will introduce that later. It's very important for you that we have been working closely with the International Organization of Employers also for translating this tool for Swiss companies. And it is also referenced in the new Swiss legislation on child labor. The second tool is a practical guide for the implementation of human rights due diligence, quite focused on SMEs, but also useful for large companies. And it is with pragmatic and effective process trying to show to enterprise how they should implement the human rights due diligence. And the third tool is much more simple, is a tool really focusing on simple process for small and medium enterprises. The next slide, please. It's also the opportunity for me to say that after this webinar series, in October, we will have a Swiss Forum on Business and Human Rights in Bern that is also organized in collaboration with Global Compact Switzerland. And of course, child labor again will be one of the focus of this event. So please note in your agenda, 18 of October 2023 in Bern. And we would like also to inform you that Swiss companies have also the possibility to participate to the International Child Labour Platform, which is based at the ILO, and I'm sure also the ILO colleague will speak about that. The next annual meeting will take place at the end of November, 29-30 of November in Geneva. This is always also an opportunity for Swiss enterprise to connect with other international companies with the same challenge, how to implement due diligence on child labor in the supply chain. Because as we all know, it needs a multi-stakeholder approach. One company by itself cannot solve the problem. We need to have a forum for that, and also the possibility to work with different governments and social partners. If you are interested to participate to all these events, you can see now on the slide the address of our website, as well as the email address for our team. And with that introduction, I would like to thank you very much, and I wish you all a very pragmatic, practical webinar, and I hope Swiss enterprise will be better equipped after this webinar series. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Valérie. Thank you for setting the scene with regards to child labor due diligence in Switzerland. I have heard, and I know that you have to go. So I would like to thank you again, and also for our audience that Miriam will be here from the team of Valérie to answer to your questions in the course of the webinar. So looking forward to further collaboration, and have a nice day, Valérie.
Thank you very much. So I'm Sophie de Koning. I'm from the Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work branch of the ILO here in Geneva at the headquarters. And thank you very much for inviting us today to speak about child labor definition, trends, and root causes, which is indeed an important presentation to set the stage for this series of 4 webinars. So I will structure my presentation around these 3 points, looking at what is child labor, what do the figures tell us about child labor, and what is driving child labor. First, it's important to recall that the abolition of child labor is a fundamental principle and rights at work. So in 1998, the member states of the ILO expressed their shared commitment to uphold basic human rights at work by adopting the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. They identify 4 categories of rights, which are listed on the screen: the freedom of association and the effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining, elimination of forced labor and compulsory labor, the abolition of child labor, and the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. So just by being member states of the ILO, member states are committing to respect, realize, and promote these fundamental principles and rights at work. Last year, there was a very important discussion at the International Labour Conference, which led to a revision of the declaration and the addition of a 5th fundamental principle and right at work, which is a safe and healthy working environment. So the principle of the effective abolition of child labor requires that every child, girl or boy, be given the opportunity to develop his or her full physical and mental potential. The objective is to prevent children from doing some work that is detrimental to their education and development. And Ambassador Berset mentioned earlier the two fundamentals ILO Convention on Child Labor, which are the Minimum Age Convention number 138, which was adopted in 1973, and the Worst Form of Child Labor Convention number 182, which was adopted in 1999. So I will now clarify 4 concepts that are important and necessary to understand what is actually child labor to be abolished. And they're very often used in an interchangeable way, and they should not. They each refer to very specific realities. So what is child labor? The legal definition is that child labor is work that is done by children below the official minimum age for employment for that specific type of work. So in general, and this is in Convention 138, in general, the minimum age for admission to employment is 15 years or more. It can be 16 years if schooling is compulsory until 16 years. But there are exceptions. So it's the Convention 138 is very flexible, and there are exceptions based on the level of development of countries. So in less developed countries, the minimum age can be initially set at 14 and with the commitment to progressively increase it. So basically it can be 14, 15 or 16 depending on the countries. But then there are also 2 exceptions that are linked to the type of work that is performed by the child. Hazardous work, and I will define that in a minute, is prohibited for any child, any person less than 18. And then for light work, there's a possibility, the convention gives the possibility to member states to identify what is light work that can be exceptionally authorized for children above the age of 13 with certain conditions. And again, here there's a flexibility linked to the level of development of a country. So what is hazardous work? Work is work by its nature or the circumstances in which it's carried out. And it's very important to make that distinction by nature, work by nature, or by the circumstances that is likely to harm the health, safety, and morals of children. The conventions do not define what is hazardous work. Hazardous work needs to be defined at national level by the competent authority in consultation with employers and workers organization. But the ILO recommendation 190, which is associated to Convention 182, provides some guidance on what could be considered as hazardous activities by a ratifying state. So basically work which exposes children to physical, psychological, or sexual abuse, work underground or at dangerous heights, confined spaces, working with dangerous machinery, equipment and tools, exposure to hazardous substance, and also, and it's important, work under particularly difficult conditions, such as work for long hours or during the night. So this is something that will guide the discussion at country level to really determine in that specific context what is considered to be hazardous or not. What is light work? It is also defined in Convention 138 on minimum age. Again, I reiterate, it's an exception to the general minimum age. Some countries have decided to set a minimum age for light work, others have not. But light work is work which is not likely to be harmful to the health and development of the child, of course, but also that should not prejudice the attendance at school or their participation in vocational orientation and training programs. So it's important to remember that the minimum age for admission to employment in a country has to correspond to the compulsory age for education. So children that are exceptionally authorized to do light work are supposed to be in school. And again, light work is defined at national level. So this is the more legal definition of what is child labor. that is, you will not find in the convention the term child labor as such. The convention provides internationally recognized criteria for defining what is child labor. In Convention 138 was adopted in 73, and 26 years later, Convention 182 was adopted. The idea is that eliminating child labor will take time. It's very much linked to the level of development of a country. But in the meantime, there are specific forms of child labor, which were then defined as worst form of child labor, that cannot wait, and that they have to be eliminated as a matter of urgency. So in 1919, Convention 182 was adopted, and that convention defines very clearly what are the worst forms of child labor. And it's defined in Article 3, so very often I refer to 3A, 3B, 3C, and 3D. So 3A is all forms of slavery or similar practices to slavery. That includes trafficking of children. It includes the use of children in armed conflict, other forms of forced labor. The use, procuring, or offering of a child for prostitution and for the production of pornography. The use and procuring of offering of a child for illicit activities, such as the production and trafficking of drugs. And again, work, hazardous work. So work which by its nature and circumstances, the circumstances in which it's carried out, is likely to harm the health, safety, and morals of children. Statistically, the very large majority of children in the worst forms of child labor are in hazardous work. So in a nutshell, as I mentioned, these concepts, child labor, hazardous work, light work, worst form of child labor, are important to understand at the end of the day, what is child labor to be abolished. This table shows there's no easy answer. It depends of the age and it depends of the type of work that is being performed. So if you look at the middle column, regular work, the minimum age of admission to employment is 14, 15, or 16, depending on the country, and work below that minimum age is considered as child labor. Above, and I'm using this color code of a traffic light, above it's green and it's perfectly authorized, it's youth employment. Light work, exceptionally authorized from 12 or 13 if the child is in school. It's important to remind it. So the green on the top and orange below. And on the right-hand column, hazardous work and other worst forms of child labor, which I just listed, they are all prohibited to any person under the age of 18. And this, just to wrap up, is another way to put all these different concepts in relation. You have the larger bubble, that is the population of children in employment, and child labor is a subgroup. So this is to say that, again, not all children in employment are in child labor, obviously. Within the group of children in child labor, there's a subgroup of them that are in the worst forms of child labor to be eliminated as a matter of urgency. And again, hazardous child labor, that is a subgroup. I insist a bit on this because I see at country level, even in national policy documents and so on, in different fora, that there's a lot of confusion about these concepts, and I hope it is now clear that they really should be used accurately to describe a specific situation. So whether a particular form of work can be called child labor or not will depend. It will depend on the age, on the type of work performed, and the answer varies from a country to country. I quickly would like to mention two sources of information where you can find information on the national legislation. The first one is NatLex. It's a database from the ILO with all the national legislation, so you can browse by country. And then I'm just taking Afghanistan. go to the category on child labor, and there you will find all the national legislation that concerns child labor. And by the way, you can find information on the labor issues in general. Normlex, in the interest of time, I will not go on the website, but you will find information on the ratification by the countries, and also it's important the comments from the committee, from the ILO supervisory body. It's always a reference for our work. So, what do the figures tell us? What is the situation in the world today? Again, Ambassador Berset referred to these figures rapidly. Every 4 years, global estimates on child labor are published. They are based on data collected at country level by the national statistical authorities. And for the first time in 2020, they were produced jointly with UNICEF. And it's important to keep in mind that these data are pre-COVID and probably don't reflect the actual situation. So worldwide, 160 million children engage in child labor, and 79 million of them are performing hazardous work. It's not because I come from that region, Africa, but I would like to say a word about the figures in the African region, because it is the most affected region in the world. More than half of the children in child labor in the world are in Africa, 92 million. And 41 million in hazardous work. And in terms of prevalence, it's also much higher than in the rest of the world. So 1 in 5 in Africa, 1 in 10 worldwide. So it is definitely a region that deserves a lot of attention. Earlier, when I gave the definition of child labor, I focused on the convention and on the type of work performed and the age. Again, in the region I come from, there's a lot of debate on what is child labor or not for children under the minimum age. So if they work a few hours per day and they go to school, is it child labor or not? I would like to draw your attention on these figures, on the number of the percentage of children in child labor that are out of school, that have absolutely no education. And the figures are quite high, as you can see. So 37% of children in child labor in Asia out of school. And you will have the presentation to have all the details. But also when children in child labor combine work and school, we also have evidence that eventually they're at higher risk of just dropping out of school. So we have to be cautious about tolerating work of children below the minimum age. There are really implications also on their education. In terms of trends, these estimates were bad news for us. They were a wake-up call. Here you see the trend over time, starting with 2000, which was the first year that the global estimates were collected, and child labor was going down, both in numbers and in prevalence. But over the period 2016-2020, we saw an increase in numbers, from 151 million to 160 million, and in prevalence, or stable, let's say, in prevalence. So this is very worrying, because target 8.7 of the SDGs is around the corner, and we definitely need to accelerate progress. I would like to remind that target 8.7 is in terms of numbers, not prevalence. So the objective is 0 child labor by 2025. Also interesting to look at the regional trends. These are the regional trends in terms of prevalence. And as you can see from the 2 lines at the bottom, in Latin America and the Caribbean and in Asia Pacific, the prevalence of child labor has gone down over the years, from about 13 to 6% for the LAC region. In Africa, it started going down until 2012 and then up again. And so again, this is a matter of concern. And in terms of numbers, We see the same pattern for the other region, child labor going down, but an increase in sub-Saharan Africa. So again, this is a region that deserves really a lot of attention because of these increases. And this gives me the opportunity to also make a transition with the third part of my presentation. Mathematically speaking, if the prevalence remains the same in Africa, because it's a very young continent with a fast-growing population, we can expect to have 105 million children in child labor in 2025 and many, many more after that. So again, this is a continent that deserves attention. And this is also a strong message that we need to focus our efforts on prevention, on preventing child labor and on addressing the root causes of child labor. So it's important to understand what is driving child labor in order to design the right policy response to address it. I will go a bit faster on this. The factors underlying child labor, they're well known. The analysis of the figures, by the way, there's much more data, interesting data in the global estimate report that I quoted. It will be shared with you, and it's very interesting to look at all the details by gender, by sector, and so on. But child labor prevails in family business, basically, and also in agriculture. 70% worldwide of children in child labor are in agriculture. In Africa, it's 81%. In countries like Mali, it's 90%. So it is also a sector that deserves our focus, and this is particularly important, of course, also in the context of the discussion on child labor in global supply chain. So concentration on these sectors, the root causes of child labor, of course, widespread poverty that is linked to the predominance of subsistence farming, informal economy, and linked to this, the important issue of the lack of living wage or income. Poor access to social services such as quality education, that's also an important factor. The schools that are either not there or too far, or the poor quality, or no school feeding as an incentive to bring children into school, all these are drivers of child labor. Vulnerability to external shock in the absence of adequate social protection and social safety nets. This is a very important one, and the last global conference on child labor that took place last year in Durban in South Africa put also an important focus on the role of social protection in eliminating child labor. It was the opportunity to launch a report with very strong evidence that social protection really contributes to reducing child labor, looking even at the different instruments of social protection that contributes the most and for which we have more evidence. And one of them is, for instance, health insurance. There's also the functional dependency to child labor. Typical example in agriculture, smallholder farming, family farming, where the families have no means to recruit external labor force, and the work is very labor intensive and relies basically on the availability of labor force within the family, including children. Social cultural factors that would of course depend a lot from a region to another, even a sub-region or country to another. Gender inequality, practices such as child fostering, and the lack of awareness also, including of parents, with regard to the risk on the health of the child. So this is an occupational health issue. Lack of freedom of association, as I mentioned, child labor prevails in agriculture, in rural economies, in the informal economy, and these are sectors that are poorly organized and no possibility to enter in social dialogue around their working conditions. Additional risk factors are precarious migration, conflict, disruption linked to climate change. Of course, the COVID-19 crisis was also a very high risk to child labor. There are institutional factors that make child labor occur. Inadequate laws, weak law enforcement, weak labor relation, and so on. There would be much more to say about this, including on the evidence that we have, but I would like to share just one last slide, which is based on analysis that we did again in Africa, and this was more at the macro level to look how child labor is related to broader development challenges. On the left, you have the map of Africa, and the middle belt of Africa, Western, Central, and Eastern Africa, these are the three most affected sub-region in the continent, and the same sub-regions are the one with the higher percentage of population below the poverty line. The same regions are these are the same regions where there's a high proportion of informal employment in total employment. And these are also the same regions where there's a very low social protection coverage. So this type of analysis that we need to pursue is again very helpful to help set policy priorities that are specific to the region. I will stop here. Perhaps in the discussion we may have also time to discuss the possible contribution of the private sector to addressing the root causes of child labor, aligning with these government efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for those insights and unfortunately those alarming figures. And yeah, we should all feel compelled to act on that. I see two questions which I think would be quite quick to, or maybe one is quick to answer, the other not. But so the quick one, which year do the maps of child labor in Africa cover? Just the ones that you showed.
Thank you. I would need to go back to it, and indeed they don't cover the same year, and also not exactly the same sub-region. In some instances, one country is out of a sub-region and so on. But I think the general idea is there. If you don't mind, I'll check quickly my files and put the answer in the chat. What happened in 2012? It's a very good question. We ask ourselves the same question. It was interesting to see a similar pattern also in the figures on education at global at continental level. But I will also provide a more specific answer to that in the chat. To summarize, there's no clear answer. We looked into this with the African Union. We did a thorough analysis of the situation in the region, and we just have elements of answers and direction, but definitely much more to look into.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, feel free to answer to the questions in the chat, and we can, depending on the time we have at the end of the session, we can discuss this again. Thank you so much, Sophie. And now I will hand over to Rita Yip. She is from the International Employers Organization. And I will quickly share my screen. Do you see my screen?
Yes, yes, I do.
Is it correct?
Yes.
This is okay. This is what we should be seeing. Great.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Rita. Welcome today. And so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alice. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and to all participants. I want to thank the Global Compact Network for inviting IOE International organizations of employers to be part of this webinar series on child labor on due diligence. I'm pleased to be here to talk about the ILO IOE Child Labor Guidance Tool for Business and why and how it was developed. Alice, if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So just a little bit about IOE. We are the largest network of the private sector with more than 150 members representing 50 million companies worldwide. We are the sole representative of business in social and employment policy debates taking place in the ILO across the UN systems, G20 and other emerging regional and international forums. So for more than 100 years, IOE has been advocating in key priorities. Alice, if the next slide, please. You will see that the priorities include child labor, business and human rights, industrial relations, international labor standards, occupational health and safety, labor migration, and many, many more. Next slide, please. Thank you. In respect to child labor, IOE is very proud to be part of several global initiatives committed to tackling child labor. We believe that only through collaboration, collective action, and strong engagement with all stakeholders that we will be able to systematically address the root causes of child labor, which Sophie had mentioned, and to also achieve SDG target 8.7 on the elimination of child labor. Next slide, please. So turning to the main discussion of why was this guidance tool developed. To answer this question, we have to go back a little bit in history when a decade ago in 2011, the UN Human Rights Council adopted the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This instrument set out 31 principles directed at governments and businesses to prevent, address, and remedy human rights abuses throughout their business operations, including in supply chains. And so this important instrument provides the blueprint for employers to develop robust management systems for due diligence. It is important to clarify that the guiding principles itself do not create new legal obligations, but clarify what existing international instruments means for companies. And it makes direct reference to the ILO 1998 Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, and also the ILO Tripartite Declaration on Principles Concerning Multinational Enterprises and Social Policy, also known as the M&E Declaration, as well as ILO standards on child labor, which Sophie also and other previous speaker has mentioned, which is Convention 138 on minimum wage and Convention 182 on worst forms of child labor, which I would like to highlight that has been universally ratified by all 187 member states as of 2021. These instruments provide the relevant standards on child labor and are legally binding on governments that have ratified them. So since the adoption of this UN guiding principles, it drew a lot of attention and also raised questions among global business community on what they need to do to comply with due diligence and the supply chains. So following this, there was in 2013, the Global Conference on Elimination of Child Labor that took place in Brazil. And following that global conference, IOE wanted to build on this momentum and the interests of child labor among the global community and join forces with ILO to provide a useful tool specific for the private sector. So our objective was really to create a one-stop comprehensive resource for employers and for business on how they can do business free from child labor by understanding what child labor is, what are the implications, what are the specific duties and responsibilities, and most importantly, how they can meet the due diligence requirements as set out by the UN guiding principles. And furthermore, we wanted a guide that would be useful for companies of all sizes, from large multinational companies with extended global value chains to small, medium-sized companies that sit within this value chains and are seeking to strengthen their own efforts against child labor, for example, to attract and reassure business partners. So with these objectives in mind, IOE and ILO published the Child Labour Guidance Tool for Business in 2015, which the content remains valid and useful for companies to comply with their due diligence obligation. I am pleased to hear from our Swiss ambassador that this guidance tool is now referenced in the new Swiss law on due diligence, and we're confident that this tool will be able to help Swiss companies to comply with their new obligations. Moving on to the next slide, please. Thank you, Alice. Turning on how this tool was developed. So this tool was developed over in 5 different stages. The first, IOE did a really deep dive on the existing resources relevant to the issues of child labor and extracted the most relevant materials for employers. We, in 2007, with ILO, built on a 3-part guide series on eliminating of child labor, focusing on the introducing what the issue of child labor is, how employers can eliminate child labor, and the role of the employers' organization in combating child labor. So we extracted the materials from this tool and also build on it with the lens of the UN guiding principles. And we also compiled the key ILO international standards and instruments relevant to child labor and broken them down into more simpler and comprehensive terms on what these are and specifically what these means to companies in countries that have ratified these conventions. Then moving on to the second stage, what IOE did was work together with SHIFT, which is a non-profit center of expertise on the UN guiding principles. The chair of SHIFT is Professor John Riggy, and his team were the authors that worked behind the UN guiding principles. And together they had a great influence on the instrument. And so with his expertise and support, the guidance tool fully unpacks the 31 principles set out in the UN guiding principles and broken them down into simpler questions and answers format for the readers to easily digest and understand what these guiding principles means. Then moving on to the third stage, in order to ensure the guidance is practical and responsive to the key challenges faced by businesses, IOE selected 5 companies from different sectors to share their insights and experience on child labor. As you can see on the slide, there's the 5 companies that are there: Coca-Cola, Angola Gold and Shanti, Vale, Japan Tobacco International, and Sterling. These participating companies received confidential individual assessments of their policies and processes against the key elements of corporate responsibility to respect human rights as set out by the UN guiding principles in relation to prohibition of child labor. And so through these, the elements that was assessed included the policy towards against child labor, the manner of conducting due diligence, including assessment impact, indicating findings, tracking and communicating performance, and where relevant, any remediation processes. So these assessments helped us to identify the common concerns and obstacles that companies have identified. Then moving on to the 4th stage, the IOE and ILO organized several workshops and peer learning exercise with with various stakeholders to discuss good practices, good business practices that contribute to respect children's rights and to identify ways to facilitate the integration of child labor concerns into company policies and processes. And so through these multi-stakeholder workshops and discussions. We really brought practical insights and experience into the guidance tool. And then finally, to make sure that the tool is accurate, widely supported, and practical for the business community, we did a 360 review with child labor and human rights experts, as well as members in the global network of the ILO and IOE, to make sure that this tool is comprehensive and accurate before it was published in 2015. So this is in Grow how the guidance tool was developed, and we hope that it is useful for the Swiss company and also other companies worldwide in helping them comply with the due diligence requirements. And to conclude, Alice, I would like to, the next slide, thank you. Just to conclude with my presentation, I would just like to share with you that IOE is launching jointly with the ILO Child Labour Platform, the CLP, the second edition of the International Elimination of Child Labour Changemaker Award. We're launching it on 12th of June, which is the World Day Against Child Labour. And this award is an opportunity to really showcase that the efforts that private sectors are doing and their work to eliminate child labor. And this year, we're really focusing on the actions that are outlined in the Durban Call to Action that was adopted in the 5th Global Conference on the Elimination of Child Labor last year. So the winners will be selected by a panel of judges and will have an opportunity to present their initiatives at the ILO Child Labor Annual Meeting in November. And more information is available on our website, but also my contact detail is on the slide there. And I strongly encourage companies and employers organizations active in child labor agenda to apply before the deadline, the 12th of August this year. So thank you very much for your attention. And thank you again for Alice for helping with the slide. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rita. That was very interesting. It's great to see how this tool has been developed. Very interesting, and brings also confidence into the tool. Also very happy to hear about this Changemaker Award. We will make sure to include this information also in our follow-up email and encourage companies to apply. Now I will stop sharing my screen, and I will invite Sandra Groth from Save the Children to share her screen and start her presentation. Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alice. A warm welcome also from my side. Mandatory question, can you see my screen?
We can, but not already in the yes, now.
Yes,
presentation.
now. Perfect. Thanks a lot. A warm welcome from my side. My name is Sandra Groth. I'm working as a Sustainable Supply Chains Manager for Save the Children Switzerland. For those of you who might not know Save the Children, we are the leading independent child rights organization with more than 100 years of experience. We work in round about 120 countries and have a local representation in Zurich. We do advise companies on child rights and business matters, as we think collaborating with the private sector is a very important tool to create long-lasting and impactful solutions for children in need. So I'm very happy to be here and to give some insights on what is the connection and the roles and responsibilities of companies. So we did hear quite a lot already about the legal framework, about child labor, the definition of child labor, root causes of child labor. But some of you might still wonder of what does my company has to do with children and children's rights? How am I connected to all this? So I think it's important to keep in mind that children below the age of 18 constitute 1/3 of the world population. So in fact, it's inevitable that business, large or small ones, have an effect on children and interact with children. So they can be part of your supply chain. They are family members of your employees. They are consumer of your products and future customers, and they are member of the communities in which the businesses operate. So the private sector has the power to either disregard or endanger the lives of children, or protect children from harm and improve their lives. So there is a lot of touch points. And for today, we want to focus on upstream supply chains and child labor, but there is more to the topic of child rights in business to keep in mind. When we talk about global supply chains, I think we have two major challenges. The one is that global supply chains are complex and often involve many processing steps, crossing different country borders, and this comes along with a lack of transparency and traceability. So I'm not sure if every one of you can truly say that they know where every product and every raw material is coming from, who produced it or harvested it, and under what conditions. So what we might be able to see is the very top of the iceberg, the so-called first tier, the direct suppliers and business partners, factories, plantations, or processing plants that you have direct business relations to. But what about below the line, the second tier, third tier, or even deeper tiers of the supply chain, or the less visible tiers, the informal sector, smallholder farms, workshops, home workers? This is where the most significant risk of child labor are, and where the most child labor occurs. And contrary to the common belief that maybe child labor happening in a family setting on the farm might be under safer conditions because the parents are present, this is unfortunately not true, because a significant share of child labor done in the family setting is also considered hazardous. So this is a big challenge that we might not even see the child labor that is existing in our supply chain. And a lot has already been done by the companies to address child labor. Policies have been drafted, code of conducts, monitoring schemes and auditing schemes have been set up, capacity building and training, and still child labor remains a challenge, especially if we have complex supply chains and sourcing from areas with significant informal economies. There are some examples provided by the US Department of Labor for commodities and crops that are harvested or cultivated under the usage of child labor. For example, coffee. According to the US Department, coffee being sourced from 17 different countries can be considered to be harvested under the usage of child labor. Same with tobacco, cotton, gold, garments, cocoa. So it's not an individual singular problem, but it's a widespread systemic challenge that we are facing. So across different regions, across different sectors, many companies directly or indirectly contribute to the challenge of child labor. And from our point of view, the crucial point is that the companies need to accept that they actively contribute to it. And they need to address the way they do business and their purchasing practices in order to find the solutions. For example, ensure that the prices they pay are sufficient to cover the cost of production, or that the orders they place fit to the production capacities of the factories. So address purchasing practices and move beyond just prohibiting child labor, these so-called zero tolerance approaches, but start addressing root causes, because by just forbidding it, you're not going to solve it, you're just going to push it away into lower tiers of the supply chain. So to put it in a nutshell of what is the company's role and responsibility and connection to the topic of child labor, we do have on the left-hand side some of the root causes mentioned before. It's about poverty, it's about a lack of access to childcare, education, or work opportunities. It's insufficient government enforcement. But there are multipliers on the business side that increases the risk and enforces the risk, like irresponsible purchasing practices, economic pressure, a lack of adequate wages, and a lack of social security for supply chain workers, a limited offering of decent work opportunities for youth, a lack of family-friendly workplaces, very remote workplaces, and the usage of migrant workers, which increases the risk, but also insufficient prevention and remediation mechanism in supply chains. And last but not least, the lack of visibility and monitoring that we mentioned before. So these are all factors contributing to the risk of child labor, where the businesses have an active role to play. And on the other hand side, we do have approaches that can help to reduce child labor risk. Supporting community-based interventions, targeting child labor root causes, assessing your own purchasing practices, the wages, the piece rates, social security systems, promoting formal employment and long-term contracts. Creating decent work opportunities for youth so that they don't have to move towards the informal sector and work in very hazardous conditions. Create family-friendly workplaces and supply chains which focuses on childcare and access to education. Proactively increase supply chain transparency and monitor your risk areas. And last but not least, set up global child labor remediation processes linked to national child protection system if they exist. So there is quite a lot that can be done that helps reduce this child labor risk, which can either be implemented in their own supply chain or supported or done in advocacy work towards local governments. So there's a lot to do, and I'm looking forward to the coming webinar series where we will have the chance to go into detail for some of these activities and kick off a discussion with a Swiss company. And yeah, I'm looking very much forward to it and happy to answer any questions that might arise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you for these very practical actions that company can take or don't take, can do to solve the problem or contribute to solving the problem. I will now hand over to Ines Kempfer from the Center for Child Rights in Business. And yes, Ines, we already see your screen. That's great. Great. Thank you so much. So we very much look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I hope you can all hear and see me well. Thank you, Alice, and everyone for having us on this webinar today. I know it's been already quite a while and a lot of speakers, so I'll try to be to the point and hope I can get your interest to hang on in there for another couple of minutes. I am the CEO of the Center for Child Rights in Business. We are a social enterprise that is actually part of the Save the Children network. And we are working directly with businesses to try to understand what their impact is on children in their supply chains and also create a positive impact on children through working with businesses. Now, it's actually very timely that we're having this webinar today. Just today, we launched a study around child rights risks in supply chains globally. I will later maybe put the link to the study in the chat box. It's very fresh. It's available in German and in English, and it has actually just launched today in a German webinar. And I'm going to share some of the data we have from this study. The study is the analysis of 20 child rights risk assessments across manufacturing, agriculture, mining in 4 regions that the center has undertaken. And with this study, we're bringing together kind of the main observations and the general observation of all of those 20 risk assessments. These risk assessments generally have been initiated by companies who asked us to go and have a closer look. in some cases also with publicly funded assessments. Unfortunately, what we've already heard a lot in this webinar really was confirmed in 50% of those assessments could we directly observe evidence of child labor, meaning we saw the children working, or we have either or we talked to them. And these are assessments that generally were announced in collaboration with the partners, etc. So we didn't go in as undercover journalists or something like that. So it was very visible, very accessible. In 8 of other assessments, we have seen a very high risk of child labor, where we couldn't observe it or see it directly, but we had the stakeholders who talked to us about the occurrence of child labor. And when I say child labor, we really follow the ILO definitions, either by age or by the kind of hazardous work that the children were doing. A couple of examples here. For example, in DRC, in cobalt artisanal mines, we have 10% of the 10 to 14-year-olds and 19% of the 15 to 17-year-olds who work in artisanal mining, and the working conditions there, and that's of the community. So it's a really significant risk. So every 10th child is of a young age is already involved, and for the teenagers, the slightly older ones, it's even every 5th. And they work under incredibly hazardous and damaging conditions. In Turkey, on rose plantations, we have seen that the children who migrate together with their parents, all of them are involved in the work on the plantations, often from a very young age of 7. We have seen some heartbreaking stories of children who have never gone to school all their life, because what they're doing is going with their parents and harvesting products, one kind of harvest season after the other in different commodities. Unfortunately, child labor is also still prevalent in production. The center has received notifications of more than 800 cases of child labor between 2019 and 2022 from the companies with whom we work. Of these, nearly three-quarters were in the first-tier supply chain and 1/4 in the lower-tier supply chain. Now, that shouldn't lead us to think that there is more child labor in the first-tier supply chain. It's just that's where we have the visibility. Indeed, what we know from the assessments is that the worst form of violations in terms of volume and severity happens on lower levels. Now, a few numbers also on child labor in agriculture and a few examples that we have observed. And again, keep in mind this really following the definition of child labor. So if a child, and we have observed that in a few cases where children sometimes help the parents, but that's in very small amount, very low hours, and the children are going to school and are happy kids. That does happen. Unfortunately, it's not the norm. So when we talk here about working, we mean working significant hours, and often hours that really have an impact on their access to schooling, on their education. Now, I know this looks a little funny, I realize, because you don't see the number, but I'll tell you the first number is a number from Sri Lanka, smallholder tea farmers, 73%, who started working before the age of 12 of the smallholders that we have met. And if you remember the definition that we had at the beginning of the webinar, that would obviously then qualify as child labor. We had a similar situation in Vietnam, where 38% of the children told us that they're helping their parents in the coffee harvest. We then heard that they're not only helping in the coffee harvest, but also in the pepper harvest and also in the rice harvest. And we talked to the teachers in school who told us that these children miss up to 6 months of school per year. And you can imagine when it's 6 months of school that you miss, then it's a significant impact. In cassava farms in Brazil, we have children as young as 7 who work on the farms, and in Indonesia, that's in the cocoa farmers, we've seen that children daily engage in hazardous work. Now, the reason it looks so funny, because I actually overlinked this with this table, and I'm also just realized a minute ago that this is in German. I hope half of you can read it. So I'm sorry about that. And we have to study in both languages. So here you can see, so I've just overlinked this, and these are on top of these child labor data, we've also have the data from these assessments around the incomes of the workers. And you can see here that blue is what they actually make. Yellow is what would be the legal minimum wage if we apply this kind of as an equivalent to what people should make if they were employed. Not all of the people here are employed, but then the gray is what the different organizations do define as the living wage, what would be needed to cover the basic needs. And you can see that throughout, all the farmers are significantly under those level of incomes. And the reason I wanted to show it like that is obviously, and I think Sandra and also Sophie pointed this out, child labor is very, very closely linked to the economic situation of the farmers. And you can imagine if you're so much under a living wage, what pressure families are under and how easily it will then lead to school dropouts, and also in farmers then deciding to include their children in the work because they need to increase their output given the high financial pressure. So really increased child labor risks, and one group that we've saw was particularly vulnerable in the agriculture setting is the children of migrant workers. I've talked about the example of Turkey. Rose is here as a picture of a little boy that we met on a rose garden in Turkey. And we've really seen that these children who move around with their parents are the most vulnerable one. They don't only work in very dangerous or hazardous conditions, they also live often in these very bad conditions, have insufficient access to schooling, definitely no early childhood education. And we also sometimes see children who are being left behind by their parents are then exposed to greater risks of trafficking or exploitation. Now, quickly, a few numbers in the productions or in the manufacturing sector. As I mentioned, the center has been dealing with over 800 cases in the last 3 years. Here are just the numbers from last year that were, and these are numbers that are, we're a small organization and we're like 50 people, and not all of us are working on child labor. We are working on other child rights risk as well. We're working with about 33 companies specifically on child labor remediation. And these are kind of the numbers that we have been given by these companies last year. You can see a very high number of cases in Bangladesh in particular, but also in Myanmar, in China, the significant numbers as well in Vietnam. And just towards the end of the year, we've actually been called in, and this number has increased in the meantime to cases that have happened in the US. And just to give you a couple of statistics around these cases, I'm not going to go for all the numbers. This is our report, which we can also share with you. But you can see it's very spread out. I think what is particularly interesting for companies to see is that the majority of child labor cases that have been reported to us have been found through audits, but within which 80% are internal audits, meaning these are not third-party audits, but it's audits that were done by the staff of the companies themselves, which I think is quite an interesting result and closely linked to the number above that you see. I don't know if you see my cursor, that there is also a significant number, obviously, on unannounced audits that have detected child labor. So just, I mean, this slide is really just to kind of make a point that this is a challenge and that still exists. As Sandra has mentioned, we are very strongly of the opinion that we should all accept that this is a challenge in our supply chains, and then really tackle it transparently and not try to get into a like, oh no, we do not accept child labor discussion. And these numbers just enforce that call for companies to accept that if you source globally, and if you don't just source in Switzerland and in Germany, then there is a really good risk that you have some child labor challenges in your supply chains, and we need to tackle those. Now, I quickly kind of maybe end with, I think I'm soon at the end, with a practical case. So we had in Myanmar at the end of last year, where 10 underage workers, so that's children under the age of 15, and 43 young workers under the age of 18 were found in a factory. What is interesting, the factory was under a lot of pressure because they didn't have any stable orders and couldn't plan their production accordingly. As a result, they let go quite a big number of their workforce. of their unionized contracted workforce. They let them go, and then replace those with kind of daily laborers. And many of those daily laborers were very young, as we saw. And this was kind of a coping mechanism of the company to deal with this unstable situation that obviously as a factory in Myanmar they were under. And I think that's a very interesting example to show how sourcing practices, or obviously nobody intended that consequence, and Myanmar is a particularly complicated case, but I still thought it was an interesting example to see that. So we've then met children aged 13 to 17 who were working both in hazardous and non-hazardous positions, but many of them had also excessive working hours, were working night shifts, and were working with sharp tools, etc. And clearly, these children were driven to take on this work due to worsened kind of poverty of their families. Myanmar is going through the military coup. COVID-19 has all worsened their situation. And then as the factories themselves were coping with that, these two things came together and made these workers very available for the factories, for these short-term laborers. And all of them were dropped, like were already out of school. As we said, none of them managed to continue the school, like education, work situation. All of them had dropped out. And okay, sorry, that's obviously also related that we see another results that we saw in the study, that young workers are systematically excluded from the formal sector and from the best factories. So they often are being hired by factories who don't have strong systems. If they're being hired, it's factories who don't have strong systems. It's workshop. In Bangladesh, we see that very clearly. If we go to one of the first-tier factories in Bangladesh, where a lot of efforts have been made through Accor and worker safety, etc., we don't find child labor. But the moment we go down in the next level, washing houses, printing houses, packaging, or mills, it's a very different picture. And one of the things that we probably going to talk hopefully about in the next webinar, when we talk more about the remediation and what we can do about all those issues that I've now listed. We'll talk about how we can better integrate young workers in the formal sector and give them opportunities. So sorry, I have lost my track of time, but I hope that was some interesting insights on kind of the child labor that we are being faced with. I was asked when we prepared these slides, what about the remediation, and said, well, it's going to be a little bit like a TV show. That's going to come in the next episode on kind of how we can support those children that are being found in that situation.
Thank you so much, Ines. That was very, very interesting. And to strengthen the message about purchasing practice, I attended a webinar from the ILO where it was said that in the garment sector, a big percentage, about 50-60% of suppliers would say that they accepted orders that don't even cover their costs just because they don't want to lose their clients. So purchasing practices are extremely important to look at. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. Now, I would like to ask everyone to share their questions. We still have about 6 minutes. Since I saw one question in the chat, I could quickly ask it, I think, to Ines and Sandra. The question was, is there child labor in the tertiary sector, so in services? Do you have an answer to that?
Sandra, do you want to go first, or?
I had a sound problem. In what sector?
In the service sector. So services.
Tertiary. Yeah.
Tertiary.
Yeah, I think it depends on the country context, whether it's tourism or there's also a big informal part in the service sector. So it's not only focused on production or harvesting or agriculture. So it's really a widespread problem that covers all different sectors. But I think it depends on the national context.
I would totally agree. I think there's actually a lot of the children that we are working with in some other projects are coming out of the service sector, of child labor situation in the service sector. We've had a project or is actually still running, that gives opportunities to out of school youth that are working, and many of them work in the service sector, nightclubs, etc. I think why the service sector comes up less in these kind of webinars is that often the linkage to the international supply chain is not so evident. I mean, they might sell Coke, but they're not a supplier to Coke, to just put it bluntly. And so I think that's why often it feels even harder for international companies to tackle issues in that sector, with the exception probably of tourism, where the linkages is stronger.
I think we can also find child labor in logistics, in transport, and very much informal as well.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah. And I think it's actually an overseen area. I totally agree. I think generally the labor rights of in logistics and people involved in transportation of goods is often just easily gets forgotten, partly because it's so informal, and I think maybe because it's not stationary, so it's not, I don't know, but I totally agree that's kind of a forgotten area of discussions. Yeah.
Thank you. Sophie just put in the chat that 19.7% of children in child labor work in the services. So this is definitely something to look at. I would like to ask our audience or our speakers as well if you have more questions. Did I oversee a question in the chat?